Leslie's family tree was interesting. My friend Tyler out in Utah was doing kind of a special dinner invitation. So we get out to Leslie's Family Tree Diner in Santaquin, Utah, which is south of Salt Lake, probably about 45 minutes to an hour. And I've been in some weird, creepy locations, abandoned buildings and places with rich history. So I walk into this place and I look around, and it does not look historically cool at all. It looks like an old frickin' little small town diner. And of course I'm thinking, what could possibly be cool about this place? It's got a lot of history, much of which I didn't know about prior to going in there. But we had dinner, and we kind of broke down into these small groups, preparing for the investigation. Everybody kind of split off to their areas. The basement, it's got a really creepy basement. In fact, Leslie's family tree was covered in dead files. So it also has a history of being... Now you're going to get traffic again. It has a reputation for being a haunted place, and for years people have talked about it. So the basement itself is creepy. That's always the first place people want to go. I want to go to the creepiest place, thinking that's where you're going to get some activity. So as soon as people split off, the first thing I did is I walked back to the monitors, and I decided I'm going to sit there for a few and kind of watch people and see what their methods are for investigating before I start joining in with them to kind of see what's going to happen. So we're sitting there talking with a couple people, and I'm watching the monitors, but the people that were there were facing me because we were talking. And all of a sudden I see on the monitor this really bright object come down from the ceiling and move towards the camera. And I said, did you guys just see that? And they all kind of turned and looked at the camera. And of course it had already gone by, so they didn't see it. But as they turned and they're watching the monitors, there was a guy in the room, there were people centered around a table, and the guy points up and follows his finger along the path where I just saw the object. And I said, that was weird. So we rewound the video, and you could see, I'm not a big believer in orbs. Most of the time we know that's dust fragments or something reflecting in the IR light. But I thought it was interesting that this guy put his arm up and was pointing in the same path that I saw this thing travel. So I went into the room and I said to the gentleman, I said, you were pointing up at the ceiling, what were you pointing at? And he said, oh, I saw a shadow up here and it moved across this way. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. I'm not convinced it's nothing more than just dust or something in the room. Maybe it was by chance, I don't know. What was interesting is a few minutes later, some people came up from the basement and they said, hey, did something happen up here? And we said, well, we just saw something on film. I'm not sure what it was. And they said, that's funny because we were just down in the basement talking to someone, and we told them to come up here and screw with the guy with the hat and the tattoos, which happened to be the same guy that was pointing up at the wall who watched the shadow, and the same path that I saw the object moving across the room. Coincidence? Probably. Who knows? I always talk myself out of actually having a paranormal experience when something like that happens. We kept going through the night investigating. I spent probably an hour by myself in the basement, didn't experience anything. And this is where it was kind of weird. Some gal came running out to us and said, oh my God, you have to hear this thing in the ceiling. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, you know when a cat moves across the floor, crawling on the carpet, the sound of the claws? And I said, yeah. And she says, it just did that in the ceiling. Ooh. And I said, okay. And I didn't think anything of it. I thought maybe the building's settling, who knows. So maybe about an hour later, someone came in and said, oh my God, we heard it. It's in the ceiling, we heard it. So a little bit later, we went back into the same room. There were probably 9 of us in the room. And I'm sitting in the back corner of the room. And I decided, okay, let's see what's going on. Now, in the meantime, there is no second floor, so anything in the ceiling would have been the roof. After the second report of something happening in the ceiling, I decided, okay, let's see if we can go sit down and figure out what's going on. And there were about 9 of us in the room, and I was in the far corner with my back against literally the corner of the room. And everybody else was in kind of the center and spread out around. And it was a pretty large room. And everybody starts asking questions. You know, can you move a chair? Can you make that noise in the ceiling? Can you bang on a wall? Can you make the fan move? Can you knock on a wall? Your typical investigative sort of questions. And this went on for probably about 15, 20 minutes, and finally I decided, okay, I want to try and reason with what's, or not reason, but at least try and elaborate why it is we're here. So I basically just say, listen, the reason we're here is because we're trying to understand if it's possible to communicate with those that have transitioned and moved on. I basically just said, this is why we're asking you to do these things. We understand that what you're asking, or what we're asking you to do, may seem trivial, but it's an indication that you can hear us and understand what it is we're trying to ask of you. And one of the things I said is, I want you to know that believing that we can communicate with those that have passed and moved on, it gives us hope that there's more than the life we live now. And I said, so if you are here and you can make a noise, can you please give us a sign? Can you please make that noise in the ceiling again? And I paused for about 3 to 5 seconds, and this noise went behind me, up the wall, and shot diagonally across the ceiling in a split second. It scared the shit out of me. Everybody in the room screamed.
What was the noise?
I don't know.
Like what?
It sounded like that.
Oh, that clawing.
Yeah, it was too fast to be an animal. The weather outside was nice. It wasn't cold. It wasn't an extremely hot day. I tried, reasoning whether it was some sort of temperature differences. The place is 150 years old. It's not going to settle, especially not like that. And running diagonally across the room, you don't run beams diagonally, so it couldn't be anything creaking odd. It could be, I don't know. There's no second story. There was no wind. But it's almost as if the whole building kind of shifted, twisted, would be how the noise sounded. But it was far too fast to be an animal. It couldn't have been anything crawling up there. And the fact that you heard it travel up the corner of the wall and diagonally in just a split second. It was, and of course everybody's screaming. Your whole body just fills with adrenaline. So then that happened. So that was the second experience. And then the third one was, after that had happened, Tyler had come up from the basement. And this is actually kind of funny. This is where history is important as far as an investigation goes. But Tyler was in the basement with a couple other people, our friend Brett, who's also a member of his team. And he says, oh my gosh, we've been talking to something in the basement, the K2's going off. And of course I'm thinking, I sat in that basement for an hour with nothing. And he says, we were playing Indian flute music. And that's when the K2 started going off. Huh. And of course, in my mind, I'm thinking, oh great, so the Indian, we're on a burial ground, I've seen poltergeists, I know how this works, blah, blah, blah. So we decided to try an experiment and see what would happen if we put K2s in the room. We probably had 6 or 7 K2s in the room. Spread them all around, and the table where Tyler and a couple other people were sitting, there were 3 of them on the table, pointing towards the center of the table. And they were probably about that far of a distance apart. So you had 1, 2, and 3. I'm still sitting in the far corner, risking my life or whatever tried to kill me earlier. And they started playing the music. I verified that he wasn't streaming it off of iTunes or something, making sure that phones were in airplane mode. He was playing it from pre-recorded music, and he starts asking questions. And his K2 starts lighting up. And I'm not a big fan of K2s. I'm not a big fan of EMF. The thing is, we're using instruments that we have no idea are actually giving us a reading of something paranormal going on. What it's giving us is an energy reading. It may have something to do with the paranormal, but we have no ideas. We have all these tools that we're working with different random spots within the electromagnetic spectrum, but what is this really going to tell us that we're speaking with a person? So we have all these instruments set up. They start asking questions, and the one starts lighting up. We probably had a half-hour-long conversation in this room, and this K2 was going nuts. But the other 2 K2s were doing nothing. They were in the black. the one sitting in front of Tyler where he was asking the questions, we would say, okay, can you make it spike to red? Boom, it would spike to red. And we'd say, okay, spike to red and stay there as long as you can. And it would spike and sit on red, which is an extremely strong reading. And we'd say, okay, stay there as long as you can, and it would just sit at red. And we'd say, okay, thank you, and boom, it would drop. It was the weirdest thing. And so finally I kept thinking, I'm walking around the room now with my GoPro filming all the K2s and trying to understand what's going on. Nothing else in the room is lighting up. But what's weird is if this K2 to spike in the red, these other two, which are sitting on the table inches away, would be, if not spiking, would be giving strong readings, picking up on what's going on. So now I'm thinking, okay, well, something's probably wrong with that K2. And I walked over and I said, if someone's here, you've been communicating to us on this K2, and I'm pointing at it, I said, you've been communicating with this device, can you use this one over here? And boom, it starts spiking. It was the weirdest K2 experience I've ever had. After all this had gone on, we said, okay, let's take a break. Let's go get some water. I walked around that room and I watched every K2. Nothing. None of them. And in fact, Brett on the other side of the room would ask questions while we were doing this, and his K2 would start spiking. But I walked around while everyone was on break and I was watching everything. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. When we were done, we came back in, started asking questions again. Boom. They started spiking again. So that was the third experience I had there. All three were kind of odd, and it was probably the least likely place I expected to have any paranormal experience. But what's interesting, and this is what was really strengthened my resolve for understanding the history of a location, we have the Indian flute music playing, right? And we're getting K2 readings. So what does everybody do? Start asking the typical Indian questions. Are you mad that the white man took your land, and blah, 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 and all this. Now, we did have reports that Indians had died in the vicinity. After this was all done, Tyler had done a bunch of research. It turns out that many Indian deaths had happened in the area. The Mormon settlers had moved in. The Indians, the younger Indians were kind of upset and didn't want them moving in. But the chief had said, no, come on in, you're welcome, you can stay here. So here it's funny, are you mad that the white man took your land? Well, no, you basically welcomed him in and gave it to him. So we're asking wrong questions right off the bat. And then it turns out what had happened was there was the chief's son had kind of gathered a group and they went to the settlers. Settlers panicked, shot a bunch of Indians. This big battle was getting ready to instill. And so the chief went to the settlers and said, hey, I gotta warn you, kids are pissed and they're coming, they want you out of here. So the settlers said, you know what, this isn't worth it, let's just leave. So they left. Well, the name of the town, Santaquin, is the chief's son's name. So we're not dealing with, so granted there was some hostility between the Indians and the white settlers that had moved in, but we're asking questions that were completely irrelevant, had nothing to do with the actual history that had gone on there. But again, we're using our own naive ideas of what history has told us to determine what it was that was happening here, and it was all false. That was probably one of the best experiences I've ever had, because I walked out of there going, I cannot believe some of the things that happened tonight, and I don't understand why they happened. Now what's interesting is we did this investigation the next night with a new group of people. Not a single frickin' thing happened. And I'm glad, because if all the same things had happened again, I would have started thinking, you know what, something's weird. We never got a spike on a K2. We never had the sounds in the ceiling. We never had anything on video. Nothing happened that night at all. So
I guess that's when it's important to know the history.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you can ask the right questions.
You have to know to ask the right questions, but at the same time, you have to know the history so that you're asking the right questions, but at the same time, the history can also manipulate the investigation to mislead you to asking the wrong questions.
That's true.
So, first of all, who's to say we were even communicating with any Indian spirits that night? But if you know a specific scenario and the history of a location, and you go in asking those questions right off the bat, you're almost blinding yourself to the infinite number of possibilities you could be experiencing because you're so focused on the one story that you want to understand. So it's a give and take, and that's why I think it's important when you have a paranormal group that you do have someone who's in charge of historical research. Limited bits of history are shared with the group, but at the same time you also allow the investigation to happen just kind of in a fluid manner. Allow the investigation to happen, but at key moments of the investigation, the historical researcher should offer up small pieces of information that say, hey, rather than, focusing on a little girl in the building, let's see if we can communicate with someone else, maybe a man, maybe a woman, maybe a group of people. And then once the investigation is done, then the history can be revealed to see how it relates to the historical research that's been done on a location. Some areas you can't avoid it. The Stanley, we all know the stories. We all know the things that happened. Brunkhouse Cabin, I already knew there were 22 murders that took place there. So going into it, I'm already going to be looking for the guys that were shot on site. But it's a give and take.